Hey everybody, welcome to another video episode of OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic US politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and lived in a number of countries besides just my own. Channeling those experiences, I try my best on this show to both translate what's going on in my own country for my non-American viewers and listeners, and to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So this is the first attempt of me doing a sort of totally unscripted or almost entirely unscripted songs, besides a few notes, reaction type episodes since I started doing a video version of the podcast. So let's see how this goes and hope that it's not a complete disaster. But with the Harris campaign having announced their decision in the Veep stakes yesterday, I wanted to just come out here 24 hours later and give my initial sort of mostly off-the-cuff analysis of the Walz pick and how I see things so far. So I will admit to having been initially pretty disappointed. Those of you who heard the last episode of OK Talks will have noticed at the very end of the episode that I made it pretty clear what my preference was for the ticket this fall. And with that being the case, I will admit I was pretty disappointed at first by the fact that Josh Shapiro is not the one picked to be Kamala Harris's running mate. In particular, I did not like the message that it sent in terms of, given the fact that there was this kind of gross campaign waged by the, yes, I'm sorry, but anti-Semitic horseshoe far end of the extreme left against Shapiro. I thought that picking anybody other than Josh Shapiro runs the risk of sending the message that Harris can be pushed around by that group of people. I've made that point to a couple of people over the last 24 hours, and some of the people who were very bullish on the Walz pick responded to me with a sort of, yeah, well, Tim Walz is great for the following reasons. And I kept having to say to that no, I was not disappointed initially in the pick of Tim Walz because I don't like Tim Walz. I was disappointed because she picked anybody other than Josh Shapiro in the context of her being pushed to not pick Josh Shapiro by a group of people whose motives were less than pure, I would argue. That being said, with the benefit of 24 hours to calm down and think about things and see some of the other analysis, and most importantly, see the rollout, I'm feeling differently. Maybe some of those folks who have been telling me how great Tim Walz was over the last 24 hours have been getting to me. Although I would argue that it's not that, because I already thought Tim Walz was great, even before having that argument put to me by these various folks. I worked in Minnesota Democratic politics for a while. I was aware of Tim Walz when I was in college there, and I've been aware of the work he's done as governor, and I've been a huge fan of him. I just thought that given the push against Shapiro, she needed to pick Shapiro to make it clear that she will not be pushed around like that. That being said, again, with the benefit of 24 hours, I'm feeling a lot better about this pick. So during the course of having thought about this and having seen the rollout event last night in Philadelphia, I have come around to thinking a certain set of things that I'm going to just kind of try to spell out here, again, with apologies for being a little bit less organized than usual. And I guess they can be summed up very briefly, although I'm going to go into more detail than this, by saying Josh Shapiro is excellent, and his speech last night should only confirm that. But I think Tim Walz brings some things to the ticket that the other two main people that were being considered, that is to say Josh Shapiro and Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, I think don't have as much. And the first of those is something that Joe Biden in his entire life, and in particular in his presidency, has demonstrated the deep importance of, which is relationships. Now, I'm sure Mark Kelly and Josh Shapiro are perfectly nice guys. I'm not saying, they couldn't build relationships. But Tim Walz has a Rolodex of sorts, I guess, that those other two men just don't have. Being realistic, Josh Shapiro was the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and he's been the governor for a little over a year and a half. Mark Kelly's been a senator from Arizona for a couple of years. Tim Walz, on the other hand, was in Congress for 12 years, which is, a decently long period of time. Also, he represented a very red district during the time he was in Congress, which I'll probably circle back to later. But that fact meant that he was somebody that was in the middle of a lot of stuff, did a lot of work with, in a bipartisan way, built a lot of relationships on both sides of the aisle. And then after those 12 years in Congress, where he was famous for being, as I think will become evident to anyone who sees him in public for more than 5 minutes, as most of you are likely to now that he's the nominee, he's clearly a very affable guy. This is a guy who people like. In addition to having been in Congress for 12 years and being the kind of congressman who made a lot of friends, because there are plenty of congressmen who do not, he also, as governor, has worked across the aisle in Minnesota. But more than that, I should have looked this up before doing the episode because now I might look like an idiot, but I think I'm right. He's the chair of the Democratic Governors Association. I can't remember if it's the chair of the Democratic Governors Association or just like whatever the name is for the sort of governors of all kinds association. But that is to say, he's somebody who has relationships in Congress. He's also somebody that has close relationships to a whole bunch of other governors. And frankly, neither of those things is super true of Kamala Harris, I don't think. It's not true, certainly, of the other two people that she was considering as the top picks for her VP, but it's also, frankly, I don't think entirely true of Kamala Harris. I mean, she was the Attorney General of California, and then she was in the Senate for about 5 minutes before she became the vice president. And in her role as vice president, I don't think that she's done a ton of work. I could be wrong about this. I'm just guessing, given the fact that she was the vice president to a man who had a half century's worth of existing relationships. I don't think that Kamala Harris was usually the person that got sent out to close the deal when it came to stuff on the Hill. I mean, in the Obama administration, you saw this happen where, frankly, Obama was in the Senate for 5 minutes before he became the president, whereas Biden had been there for decades. So when they needed to close a deal on the Hill, they sent Biden. I think during the Biden presidency, it's been a similar dynamic where Biden has been the one who has the relationships. And I don't know how much has been done to cause Harris to build those. So I think that Walz provides a huge asset in that sense to the ticket that neither Josh Shapiro nor, to as much of an extent, does Mark Kelly. A second thing that Walz brings more of than those other two, but particularly Shapiro, if I'm being honest, is experience. And if the Biden presidency has taught us anything, it's that experience is good. I mean, the most experienced Democratic presidents have usually not been the charismatic ones that the kids like, who give big rallies and make everybody feel happy because, whatever. But they have been the most effective ones. Johnson, Biden, Roosevelt, although he, I think, made most people happy. But Johnson and Biden will go down in history as two profoundly underrated presidents who got more done than almost anybody else in their position. And what they both had was tons of connections on the Hill and tons of experience. Tim Walz was in Congress for 12 years. He's been the governor of Minnesota for 6 years. Mark Kelly's been in the Senate for 4 years, and prior to that, he had no political experience. Josh Shapiro has been the governor of Pennsylvania for a year and a half. He's been a very successful governor. But Tim Walz just brings a lot more experience and relationships to the ticket. And that is making me a lot more bullish on the pick of Walz than I was initially, given my initial sort of angry emotional reaction to the fact that the guy I wanted didn't get picked. If I may as well be honest about that. All of this leads me to say, I don't know whose analysis I'm stealing right now, but there's someone, again, I don't remember who coined this way of thinking, but somebody talked about vice presidential picks as falling into 3 categories: August picks, November picks, and January picks. So here's what that means. An August pick is a vice presidential candidate that you pick because your campaign's in trouble. Because your campaign is in trouble right now in August, and you need to totally change the dynamics of the race. So a great example of that, Sarah Palin. The McCain campaign was floundering in the summer of 2008. It was not doing well. The existence of Barack Obama had completely upended the political space, and they needed like a pivotal dynamic moment to shift the campaign, or they were completely fucked. So they picked Sarah Palin, which was a huge gamble and did not pay off for them, as anyone who knows anything about Sarah Palin knows. But that is to say, an August pick is a sort of desperate gamble taken by a campaign that's struggling. This is clearly not an August pick. A November pick would be a person that you pick because you think that they will help you win in November. Like somebody who very clearly will lock up the electoral map. I don't say this to say that I don't think Josh Shapiro would have been an excellent vice president. I do think that he would be. Shapiro was a November pick, in my analysis. And this is a person who most of the argument for Josh Shapiro is, well, he's a really good campaigner. He's a really good politician. He's good on the stump, A, and B, he locks up Pennsylvania, which is the electoral ballgame. Those are both advantages that you point to in terms of one's ability to win an election. A January pick is somebody that you pick because you're thinking about, January 20th, 2025, when you become the president, and who will be probably the most likely to be helpful to you in the role as president. This is a January pick for all the reasons that I just laid out before about why I think Tim Walz would actually be an excellent vice president. This is a January pick. And it shows a level of confidence that I hope the campaign feels that it's earned. I desperately hope this isn't a gamble that doesn't pay off. I hope that we don't lose Pennsylvania and end up thinking on November, I can't remember exactly what date the election is, but thinking the first week of November on Wednesday, whatever day it is, oh, fuck, we really should have picked Josh Shapiro. But Tim Walz, for all the reasons that I outlined before, I think will make a really strong governing partner for a President Kamala Harris. And I also think that he will be helpful in the campaign. And the sort of folksy vibe thing, it's real. Since I'm doing this as a sort of off-the-cuff reaction type episode, and I'm pretty busy today, I don't have the time to go and put together a set of clips from the rollout event last night. But if you haven't seen it already, go watch that event. Watch from Shapiro onward, because Josh Shapiro, I will say, Josh Shapiro in this speech that he gave last night at the event where the Harris campaign, sort of presented Walz as the pick, it was phenomenal. Josh Shapiro is an incredible orator, an incredible public speaker and campaigner. That was a fucking tour de force. And that man should run for president someday. And when he does, I will certainly vote for him. It was really good. That being said, Harris's speech was also excellent, and Tim Walz's speech was also very, very good. This is a man who has not operated on the national stage before. He's been a congressman and a governor. This is not, I think, somebody who's used to going into a packed, sports arena that's full up to the roof of people and giving a speech like that. But he fucking nailed it. It was really, really good. The perfect blend of zingers, which, for anybody who doesn't know, the role of a vice presidential candidate in the campaign trail is to attack the other ticket, and it's really good at that. For anybody who doesn't know the couch joke, well, I don't know. Maybe go look it up, maybe don't. Actually, I'm just going to tell you, there's a rumor going around that J.D. Vance had inappropriate relations with a couch of some sort. I don't know if it's true. I don't care if it's been debunked, frankly, because it sure as hell wouldn't stop them from spreading a rumor like that about one of our people. And Walz slipped that in there into his speech in a way that was really good. Perfect combination of humor, charisma, and connection. This is a man who can connect. People keep talking about how oh, this is a guy who, who you can imagine coming over and helping you fix the carburetor or whatever on your car. Yeah. I've never wanted to be one of the who would you like to have a beer with, but I know who I'd like to have a beer with of the four people that are the top of the ticket, this year. It's a pretty easy choice for me. A combination of charisma, humor, connection, and just sort of genuineness. This person it's so clear that he's not bullshitting, which is so refreshing after us having been exposed to Donald Trump for as long as we have been. Now, it would be malpractice for me to analyze this without noting that the right is going to try to tag Walz as some sort of hair on fire communist nutcase, a Bernie Sanders, with a different act, a Bernie Sanders who, instead of saying, our entire campaign finance system has been hijacked by millionaires and billionaires, will say, oh, gosh, don't you know those millionaires and billionaires have totally taken over the campaign finance? They're going to try and say that, Walz is Bernie Sanders from the Midwest. I think that this, and they've already been seeding this. There's been all this sort of reporting of Republicans saying like, "Oh, thank God it's not Josh Shapiro. We were afraid it was Josh Shapiro, but apparently the Democrats are just anti-Semites." So I think this is bullshit. I think this is them attempting to play into this notion that Tim Walz is some sort of, again, some sort of pinko nutcase, who came back from his collective farm to try to nationalize the entire market or something. And I don't think it's going to play. I do think, frankly, that some of the fact that Walz is being analyzed this way right now is coming from the fact that he did appear to be the preferred choice of the horseshoe end of the far left, and I think realistically that some of the fact that he was the choice of the horseshoe left among the three guys that were bandied about as the main ones is grounded in the, yes, sometimes anti-Semitic backlash to Shapiro more than it is in the idea that Tim Walz is basically a member of the squad. Because I don't think that that's the case. And I think that it's going to be really hard for Republicans to actually get that to stick once he's out there campaigning. I mean, the guy we saw last night, he doesn't code like a guy who's coming here to nationalize all of the industries and confiscate your private property so that it can be redistributed to the masses. Like I don't think he plays that way. And now to be like, yes, Tim Walz has had a very successful liberal governorship of a light blue state. That has come with huge investments in education, which includes both reducing, or I think at least reducing substantially, tuition for college for people that are below a certain income bracket, and increasing school lunches for poor kids that are in school. He has restored voting rights for felons, which frankly I would assume that the Republicans would now be in favor of, given that their nominee is a fucking convicted felon who arguably would not be able to vote under the rules that they, in theory, had previously endorsed. He increased funding for police, which promoted better training and community policing and body cams and stuff, expanded paid leave, huge investments in like housing and infrastructure, a bunch of like anti-monopoly stuff, which again, if you're a capitalist, an actual capitalist, monopolies are your enemy. The right to repair stuff you buy without necessarily having to take it back to the Apple store or something like that. Pushing back on this sort of nonsense of like, hey, Arby's worker, sign this non-compete clause so that if you get bored of Arby's, you can't go work for McDonald's. How is that capitalistic? How is that competitive? Him taking down those things is not some sort of pinko commie agenda. It's making capitalism work. He also pushed universal background checks in Minnesota, which again, most gun owners support. He's also a gun owner and a hunter himself, by the way. Walks around in a camo hat. This guy's a lot more Trey Crowder than AOC. It's really hard for me to imagine that they're going to be able to successfully stick him with some sort of extreme left nutcase thing, unless they think that him pushing abortion protections after the extreme right Supreme Court somehow makes him like a far right person, except that that's a position supported by over 70% of the American people. All of his work as governor has resulted in like a very low unemployment there. Also, he pushed through like huge tax cuts aimed at the middle and working class. I thought Republicans liked tax cuts. Like, he's been a very successful liberal governor of a light blue state, but I don't think that his record in Minnesota, I mean, there are some like trans protection stuff that the Republicans don't like and are going to try and throw at him. But I mean, I don't think that Tim Walz's term as governor of Minnesota during a period of time in which he had Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate of that state is any different than it would have looked like if Joe Biden was the governor of Minnesota, for example. And if you think that Joe Biden's a commie, well, you might just be a MAGA person and your analysis is not worth very much anyway. So I will say, after all this, in my ideal world, Tim Walz comes out at some point and directly addresses the attacks that were waged against Josh Shapiro during the Veep stakes. In my ideal world, he comes out and says something like, I got to say, I know there was a lot of people who supported me to be the vice presidential pick, and I appreciated all that support. One thing I have to note, however, although I think I was the best qualified to be the vice presidential pick, and obviously Kamala Harris felt the same way, and I appreciate that, I know that there were some people who supported me specifically because they had a problem with my good friend, Governor Josh Shapiro. And I also know that some of the people who had a problem appear to have had that problem because of his faith or because he was too pro-Israel or something like that. And I just got to say to people who opposed my friend Shapiro for that reason, well, I'm going to be your worst nightmare. And yeah, by the way, sorry in advance. If Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win the election this fall, get ready for 4 years of a terrible Minnesota accent born from my 4 years of going to college in Minnesota, because I'm most certainly not going to spare you that unless I'm lobbied very hard by most of the audience to not do it. Now, I would love it if Tim Walz came out and said something like this. I don't think he would go that far. Even without that, his references to Josh Shapiro in the speech that he gave yesterday were incredibly magnanimous. And again, I think given his record, his voting record in Congress, when he, by the way, as I mentioned, he has had a very successful liberal term as governor of Minnesota. But most of the stuff that has gotten done when he was the governor is good governance. It's good governance that you would see in any context where you have a Democratic House and Senate and a Democratic governor. And frankly, if you don't want to live in a state that invests more in education, that increases funding for better training and body cams for police, that has paid family leave, that invests properly in its infrastructure and its environment, that protects women's right to have abortions, and that lowers taxes on poor people and working class people and middle class people, thus spurring economic growth and resulting, and other things resulting in super low unemployment. If that's not the kind of state you want to live in, I don't know what you would prefer, because those things all sound pretty good to me. My point being, trying to get back to the point I was making there, trying to remember what it was. He has a liberal record as the governor of Minnesota. He has a moderate record during his time in Congress. His voting record in Congress and his statements, that's where I was going. Sorry about that. His voting record in Congress and his statements in statements in the position of governor of Minnesota, and particular in the wake of the terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, where he's repeatedly called out. He was completely on the right side of his interpretation of the attacks as being terrorist attacks by a vicious terrorist organization that needs to be destroyed. He also, just as much as Josh Shapiro, has talked about how some of the protests on college campuses created an unsafe environment at times for Jewish students on those campuses, and has condemned those things. People who are happy that Tim Walz is the pick because they wanted Josh Shapiro to not be the pick because he was too pro-Israel or because he's Jewish, I think they're going to be pretty fucking disappointed in Tim Walz in the end. Because if they think that this guy is basically Rashida Tlaib with white hair, no, he is not. No, he's not. This man is going to be an excellent vice president who, as I wrote in the talking points going out to Democrats abroad around the world right now as part of our organization's work, a man who brings the ethos of an enlisted soldier from rural America, a small-town teacher, and a high school football coach to the work he's done as one of America's most successful and popular governors. This was a good pick. My initial reaction was wrong, and I'm very happy about it. And I'm very proud to come out here at the end of this episode, which I think was not a complete disaster. My apologies for being a little less organized than usual, and say, Harris-Walz 2024. If you haven't already donated to the campaign, do it. If you haven't signed up to volunteer, do it. Phone banking, done it a lot. The first 2 or 3 calls you make are scary. Gets easier after that. It's worth it. We know what we're up against. And now we know what we're for. And what we're for is pretty fucking good. So ask yourself what more you could be doing to help get this campaign across the finish line, and then go do that thing. Harris-Walz 2024. All right, that's it for this episode of OK Talks. If you like the show, particularly the way it usually is, in a way that's a bit more organized than it was today, be sure to hit subscribe or follow the channel or whatever it's called on whichever platform you're watching or listening. If you really want to do me a solid, be sure to hit like and leave a comment of some sort. And most importantly, be sure to share the show with anybody you think might get something out of it. Thanks, as always, to anybody who already has. Thanks in advance to anybody else who will. Thanks to Nate Wright for having designed the podcast artwork, and to everyone else for listening.